there? Looks like we've got 4 viewers, so maybe not a ton. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Hello. Why is nobody seeing me? Why is nobody seeing me? Oh, everybody is seeing me. Okay, excuse me. Pardon me. I thought, oh my goodness, the broadcast hadn't started yet. The broadcast has started. Okay. Whew. All right. So let's talk about what a behaviorist think. Now, behaviorism rose to prominence right around 1900 to 1910. And at that time, the United States had a huge problem. The industrialization that had begun to take hold sort of in the 1870s had really created a ton of big cities with huge populations. And when you get a ton of people, you start to get societal ills. You start to get things like violence, prostitution, drug use, and all of these other terrible outcomes. And people were wringing their hands trying to figure out how we should fix this particular problem. What was causing it? Now, there was a movement in America called the eugenics movement, and it was based on this new science of genetics, and they believed that people were born good or born bad. And they thought that the solution to our problems in America were to identify the people who had poor genetic material and sterilize them or keep them out of the country. That was one viewpoint on the problems associated with the industrialization in America. However, behaviorists rose up as an alternate viewpoint. And what these people believed is that, in a sense, we're all born with the same intellectual, social, and emotional faculties. The difference, they would say, between us is dependent upon the environment in which we live. So how your environment shapes you. So for example, Ken, if you're good at math and I'm not good at math, it's not because you're inherently better at math. It's your early environment shaped you to be better at math than did mine. Why are people criminals? Well, because their early environment reinforces that criminal-like behavior. Why do people take drugs? Well, if you think about it, you might say that kids get depressed when their parents yell at them, and maybe taking drugs makes them feel better for a few minutes. So in a sense, you might say that drug use is conditioned by our environment. We're trying to escape pain. So the behaviorist point of view grew up, and it was a time when psychology hadn't done anything valuable, and the behaviorists believed that they could really inform this discussion and transform the way that American society worked, because they believe that everything that we are is dependent upon our environment. And if so, then we can learn how to shape the environment in such a way that it prevents violence, that it prevents prostitution, that it prevents drug use, that it causes all of these good things to happen, right? So your book's going to talk about different types of learning, which is a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Now I want to focus on this definition for just a second. Number one, it's relatively permanent. Any change in behavior may go away if the environment changes. And for the behaviorists, they were called the behaviorists because they focused on behavior. So it's a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experiment. Now, behaviorists were scientists at heart. And really, this is going to be hard for you to believe because we grew up in a world of psychological testing. But in 1900, it still hadn't been proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that our minds engaged in systematic processing of information, and that these rules were the same for each and every person. Now, the invention of the computer would change all of that, but that's still 40 years away. But at this point, people really believe that it's hard to measure the mind systematically. So these behaviorists said, you know what, as scientists, the only thing we can develop theories about are behaviors. So let's build a science that tries to explain how people's behaviors are affected. And so they were not interested in this thing called the mind. In fact, the father of behaviorism, John Watson suggested that the mind maybe came after the fact to explain why your behavior had done something. So he didn't even think that the mind had anything to do with our behavior. And he said, let's take it out of the scientific equation. All right. And so these behaviors start out in 1900 looking for the qualities that affect our behavior in relatively permanent ways and can be explained without using mentalistic concepts. Now, your book talks about all types of learning, and it's got three broad groups. So you've got inhibition and habituation, then you've got associative learning, and then you've got modeling. Today and tomorrow, we're going to focus only on the middle branch, the associative learning, which is where we learn to associate the relationship between two pieces of information, right? So, and this associationism, it's not a mental construct. It was thought to occur in the neurological matter. So, you might have an experience of happiness, and that's represented in your neurons one way. And then you might eat a piece of pie, and that might stimulate these other neurons. And if you like that piece of pie, the liking neuron and the apple pie neuron would associate together. So it was thought that consequences, environmental consequences, made neurological impacts that would be joined together. All right. Now, in your book, they're going to talk about two broad behaviorist models. Now, we're going to focus on the associative, and we're going to call it behaviorism, because these behaviorists, like I said earlier, didn't believe in the power of the mind, and they didn't have that anywhere at all in their scientific definitions. Now, if you'll look at the chart in chapter 6, this is associative learning. You're going to have modeling on one side and the habituation on the other, and those to a certain degree are going to integrate cognitive concepts. But these people right here, these two models, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, were thought to occur similarly in animals that may not have minds as they would in humans that did have minds. So do you see how we're working in a sort of an anti-mentalistic concept here? Now, two people we're going to talk about today, Ivan Pavlov and this stuff called classical conditioning, and B.F. Skinner, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, in operant conditioning. Today we're just going to focus on Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning. Now, Ivan Pavlov was actually not a psychologist. He was a Russian physiologist studying digestion. In fact, he was so good at studying digestion that he actually won a Nobel Prize for it. I think it was in 1906 for his work on digestion. Right? Now, digestion and salivation, for his work on salivation. Now, it turns out salivation is a reflex response. Do you folks know what a reflex response is? That's a response that you make, that's a behavior that you engage in response to an environmental stimulus. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to learn it. It just automatically happens. And so if you smell a lasagna or a piece of fish or something that tastes really good, right, involuntary, that tastes really good, your mouth will automatically begin to water. Whatever it is you really, really love to eat, when you smell it, your mouth will begin to water. Salivation is a digestive reflex. You don't have to think about it. It automatically happens. And what this guy, Ivan Pavlov, realized was that the dogs started to associate environmental cues with this reflex response and to create what he called reflex learning or psychic reflexes. All right. Now, in classical conditioning, we have what's known as a passive learner who does nothing but associate environmental cues with reflex responses. What's a reflex response? Salivating to something that smells good. Here's another reflex response. Have you folks ever been to the doctor and had the glaucoma test where they blow the puff of air in your eye? What happens when they blow the puff of air in your eye? You automatically blink, right? What's the reflex response if somebody comes up behind you and makes a loud noise? You jump, the startle reflex. So we have startle reflex, we have eye blink reflexes, we have gagging reflexes, we have salivating reflexes. These are all unlearned responses. And what he found with the dogs, he was studying digestion in dogs, and what he found was that the salivation reflex could be associated with things that typically didn't elicit the salivation reflex. All right, so in a sense, here's the example that he demonstrated, the experiment that he demonstrated. So you'll notice that when presented with the food powder, the food bowl, the dog begins to salivate. This is a reflex response. And he gave a name to the food and the dog's response. He called the food the unconditioned stimulus, and he called the dog salivating to the food the unconditioned response. We're going to use the word unconditioned because unconditioned means unlearned. A reflex is unlearned. I hope that makes sense to everybody. If you have any questions or want to say anything, please feel free to sing out. All right, now, he then paired the food with a metronome. So what he would do is he would start playing the metronome, tick, tick, tick. Then he would put the food in front of the dog, and the dog would salivate because of the food. Now, in the beginning, the dog didn't salivate to the metronome. And so he called this metronome a neutral stimulus. Or he did this experiment with a bell as well. Y'all might have heard of ring a bell and I'll salivate. He would ring the bell. And when you ring the bell, the dog doesn't salivate because it's a neutral stimulus. But what he would do is he would pair the metronome or the bell with the food time after time. Metronome, food, the dog will salivate to the food. Metronome, food, dog salivates to the food. Metronome, food, dog salivates to the food. And after 6 or 7 pairings, what he found was he could just put the metronome up there and the dog would begin to salivate. Now, he had a different name for the metronome once it started to make the dog salivate. He called it a conditioned stimulus, okay? And he called the fact that the dog was salivating to the metronome, he called that the conditioned response. The conditioned response. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to you. And so he could suggest a pattern where you could learn to associate these neutral stimuli with the reflex, and the reflex would begin to elicit with a neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus would begin to elicit the reflex response. For example, I guarantee you I could do this. With the air test, the little glaucoma test, they do the puff of air. The puff of air makes you blink. Here's what I could do. I could play a tone, beep. And if I play a tone, you're not necessarily going to blink. But what if I did beep, puff of air? You'd blink. Beep, puff of air. You'd blink. Beep, puff of air. You'd blink. Now, the beep at the beginning would be called a neutral stimulus. But after pairing it with the puff of air 5 or 6 times, maybe not even that much, the beep would cause your eye to blink. And then the beep would be a conditioned stimulus, and blinking in response to the beep would be the conditioned response. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Now, he had some terms that he used when he was discussing this. As the dog was learning the behavior, between the time when the dog didn't engage in the classically conditioned response and the time that they did, he would call that the acquisition of the behavior. So as he was pairing the metronome with the food, the dog might begin to salivate a little bit. He called that acquisition of the behavior. Now, here's the deal. If you quit pairing the metronome with the food, all right, after a while, the dog will quit salivating in response to the metronome. Remember earlier I said that the definition of learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. If you quit pairing the food with the metronome, after a while, the behavior will be extinguished. You will see extinction. Okay, so if I trained you to blink to a sound because I paired it with the puff of air, if I quit doing the puff of air long enough, you would quit blinking to the sound, and we would say that the learning had been extinguished. Does that make sense? Now, the neat thing is, Pavlov would keep doing this for months. And he would find that once the behavior was extinguished, it would go away for maybe weeks or months at a time. And then all of a sudden, the dog would begin engaging in the conditioned response for a short period of time. And he referred to this reemergence of a behavior that had been extinguished as spontaneous recovery. Does that make sense? Now, how does that work in real life? How about this? Are any of you afraid of the beach? Are any of you afraid of the ocean? How about this? Your parents take you to the ocean. Now, the ocean is a neutral stimulus the first time you go in because you're a 3-year-old, right? But then all of a sudden, you just happen to be unlucky enough to brush up against a jellyfish. Now, does anybody know what happens when you get stung by a jellyfish? It hurts and you cry, right? Now, that may not be a reflex, but that's an involuntary response, right, KB? So the jellyfish stung you and it made you cry. Now, you just happened to be in the water when you were stung. The water had nothing to do with you being stung. But your parents take you back to the beach the next year, and suddenly they bring you out to the water, and you start crying, and you're afraid to go into the water. You've had a classically conditioned fear of the water. So the jellyfish sting is the unconditioned stimulus, which causes the pain, which is the unconditioned response. Remember, please think it is not learned, it is unlearned. Right? Now, if I give you an example, you identify the thing, the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. Now, find out what the neutral stimulus is that just happens to be associated with the unconditioned stimulus. In this case, you happen to be at the beach in the water when the jellyfish stings you. So now you're afraid of the beach in general. This is the conditioned response. Excuse me. And the beach itself is the conditioned stimulus. Does this make sense? Now, there's one other thing that I did want to point out about this. I don't know if you folks know, but celebrities get paid a ton of money to endorse products. And I would like you to know that celebrity endorsement is nothing but a classically conditioned process. It's what we call higher order conditioning. Now, let me step back a minute and say one of the things Pavlov found is once you condition an animal to salivate to a metronome, you can then use the animal salivating to a metronome as the unconditioned stimulus to condition a new response. So first, he would use the meat powder to condition the animal to salivate to a metronome. He would then pair the metronome with a bell, and he found he could make the dog then salivate to the bell using the metronome. Once he had conditioned the dog to salivate to the bell, he could then put a buzzer with the bell and condition the dog to salivate to a buzzer. So he could continue to use each conditioned response as a new reflex behavior to condition the next reflex behavior. Does that make sense? Now here's the deal. Check this out. Some actor is in a movie that you absolutely love. And because you love that movie so much, when you watch that movie, it made you cry, it made you happy, have tears of joy. That's the reflex response, the great story and your feeling of happiness. Now, it just so happens that Tom Cruise or whoever was in the movie. Could have been any number of actors, but because that story was so good, you now have this feeling of positivity towards Tom Cruise or any other actor. I'm kind of old, so I'm picking an older actor, but it could be any actor. Now what you can do is you can have that actor hold your product, and your product will be more valuable. Think about it. The Kardashians, the reason that they make a ton of money is because they have such a following of positivity that if they like an object, every other teenage, probably female, in the world likes that product as well. So celebrity product endorsements are what we would call higher order conditioning, which is where you use a conditioned stimulus or a conditioned stimulus to condition another stimulus. Does that make sense? I have a feeling I'm probably losing everybody. Yep, I've only got 3 of you. Yeah, it's all right. We'll carry on. All right. So, oh no. I'm missing one slide, so let me bounce over to my next slide real quick. Hold on. 6A, I wonder what slide I'm missing. I am missing, okay, right. So here's the deal. I want to tell you about the most famous of all classical conditioning assignments. Let me see if we got it here. Window capture. Okay, here we go. All right. Probably, hold on, let me resize it down just a little bit. Okay, there we go. All right, here we go. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. Give me just a second and I will figure this back out. Hold on just a minute. Audio input. Dadgummit. And okay, you won't hear me. Okay, you won't see me, but you'll hear me. Can you hear me, Ken? You probably should be able to hear me by now, is what I'm hoping. You can hear me now. Let me know if you can hear me. Okay. Fantastic. You can probably hear me. Let's see. Okay, fantastic. All right, so what he did was he took this kid who didn't have any fears, and he would put a rat right in front of him, and then he would come up behind him with an iron bar and a hammer, and he would bang it just as loud as he could, and little Albert would cry, 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 because the loud noise was an unconditioned stimulus, and the fear response caused him to cry. That's the unconditioned response. And the rat was a neutral stimulus. And then the next day, he would put that rat in front of little Albert, and he would come up behind him, and he would bang on that bar again with the hammer. And the rat was a neutral stimulus, and the sound was the unconditioned stimulus, and little Albert's crying was the unconditioned response. And after 4 or 5 pairings, guess what happened? When he would put that little rat right in front of little Albert would start crying, just as if that rat was the most scary thing in the entire world. And so the rat was now the conditioned stimulus, and little Albert crying because of the rat was called the conditioned response. Okay? And so what he had done was he had created an irrational fear of an object, right, in little Albert. Now, the crazy thing is, little Albert was so scared by this that little Albert began to be afraid of things that weren't even the rat, but were white. So suddenly he was afraid of kittens or white puppies or even a man in a white beard. So he sort of generalized his fear to anything which was even similar to the stimulus at hand. And so John Watson had classically conditioned in a young infant a phobia. Now, I don't know if any of you are thinking about this right now, but that's probably a horrible thing to do to an infant. Yes, it was. But that's what they did to little Albert in this experiment. You probably could never, well, not probably, you could never ever do this experiment now. But in the 19-teens, I think it was like 1911, this demonstrated the power of classical conditioning to create real behaviors in people. Now, I hope that we never do that study again, but one of the things we did learn is a therapeutic technique to help people who are suffering from phobias. So counter-conditioning, or sometimes it's called systematic desensitization, is a strategy where we try to uncondition a conditioned response. So if your fear response is when you see spiders to start crying and become very, very upset, what I need to do is I need to create a new classically conditioned paradigm. What I need to do is to teach you how to relax and have you get around spiders while staying relaxed. Now, if you'll notice that on the right side, we have what's known as a fear hierarchy. Now, I can't expect you to stay relaxed if I have you look at something that's too scary. So what I need to do when you first come into my office is to have you come up with a list of presentations of a spider, the feared object, whatever it is, going from one thing that you think you could handle all the way up to the most scary experience you could have with that particular animal. And so in a sense, you might think about a spider, you might look at a photo of a spider and see how each of them have a fear rating. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to relax yourself. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to have you relax and think about each level of your fear hierarchy. And it might take you a couple of weeks to get from each level to the next. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to get you to learn how to relax while you're experiencing the feared object. And this is what's called counter-conditioning. Now, I don't have an example of counter-conditioning, but I do have an example of exposure therapy that I want to show you. You're really, really going to like this, and then we'll be done with the class, okay? Now, in exposure therapy, what happens is the therapist gets you into a situation where you're around the object that scares the hell out of you, and then they help you work through your fear response. Now, I'd like to show you this short video clip of a lady who suffers from coulrophobia, which is the irrational fear of clowns. It's real, and it can be devastating for people that have it. So I'd like you to watch this short video clip as this lady is treated for coulrophobia using exposure therapy.
I've suffered with this my entire life, and it's kind of a joke in the family. We all kind of laugh about it, you know, but it's embarrassing to tell people. I can't go to circuses. I can't go somewhere where there's clowns, even a picture of it.
Call that a clown?
That's a gesture.
That doesn't bother you. So does that count as a clown? Can you give me numbers 0 to 100? How about this guy?
Maybe 50.
You ready? This one's kind of scary.
Oh, gosh.
Go ahead and take a look at it. What's going to happen if you look at it?
Nothing.
All right, let's take a look. Stare at it. Good. Can you give me a number? Keep on looking, you're doing fine. It's okay, you're doing okay. You're fine. Stay with it. Give me a number.
65.
Good. This can be a big room. There's about 4 or 5 people in there.
How big room? Like that size?
About that size. Probably a little bit bigger.
Is the clown gonna be in there?
The clown's in there. We're gonna walk in. We're gonna take a seat.
I can't walk in with a clown there.
What's gonna happen?
I'd rather be sitting there and have him come in or something.
Okay, what's gonna happen?
I'm gonna turn around and I'm gonna leave.
Why?
Because I don't think I'm ready for this. I'm prepared for this.
What's gonna happen if there's a clown in the room? Is he gonna hurt you?
No.
Okay, are you gonna have a strong physical reaction?
Yes.
Have you had that before?
Yes.
Okay, you stay put. I'm gonna tell. His name is Mr. Giggles.
What?
His name is Mr. Giggles. He's a clown. Hang on a sec. We'll go get him to move.
Chris keeps her stuffed animal Parsley close by for comfort.
Okay, let's do this.
Psychology students and a few of their friends have volunteered to participate so Chris won't have to face the clown one-on-one.
Just have a seat. I'll go get him. Okay, here we go. All right, ready. Head on in.
Hi everybody, I'm Mr. Giggles. How's everybody today?
Doing well.
Righty.
Give me a
I'm
number.
just going to sit down right here, and I think we're all going to learn how to make some balloons. I'll start with a balloon dog.
You're doing great.
Balloon dog is the first thing they teach you how to make when you go to clown school, kids. And like I tell all the other kids, everything you got to learn how to do, you got to go to school.
Doing a great job.
Does anybody here know how many heads a dog should have? No. Oh, come on. Dog has 1 head. How many ears does a dog have? 2, that's right. Alrighty. And nose is too long or too
Anything
short
bad happen
because
yet?
whatever kid you give this to is going to say
Good.
that's just 3, okay?
Stay with it.
Alrighty, we got one kid here, he's going to catch up here. Are we catching up? Okay, we need. Now, what you're looking at, you have a dog with 2 ears. Alrighty.
You're doing fine.
Okay, kids, now we're going to do the same thing we did before. All this is the same thing over and over again. While we're holding on to the first bubble, we're going to go ahead and we're going to make another one. So that now it looks like this here. But don't worry.
You're doing a wonderful job.
As she keeps her eye on the clown, Chris's anxiety begins to lift.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I'm actually gone up to the to the playroom. It's kind of dark in here. I wanted to get as close as I could to the to my router. Hopefully that improved the video experience just a little bit. All right, so here's the deal. What I wanted you to get from today, behaviorism is let's call it behaviorist perspective. It's a way of studying the human being that focuses on the power of the environment to shape our behavior. Behaviorism specific is named so because it specifically doesn't focus on how our thoughts, how our cognitions, and how our beliefs shape us. Instead, it focuses only on how our environment and the things that happen to us shape our behavior. Okay? Classical conditioning is one model by which our environment shapes us. And this is when our environment where reflex responses are paired with environmental stimuli to create new learned reflexes. Little Albert was a great demonstration of a phobia, or of how classical conditioning can work to create a phobia. And counter conditioning is a therapeutic technique that relies on classical conditioning to help people unlearn maladaptive behaviors. All right, so that's really all I have to say today. Thank you for staying with me for 38 minutes. I hope everybody had a great time today. and I will have lecture or the second part of chapter 6 tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and I hope to see everybody there. Take care, and until I see you tomorrow, have a great day.
Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please consult your directory and call again, or ask your operator for assistance. This is a recording.